or good evening, and whatever time zone people are in. And thanks for joining us for the Life Course Research Network webinar made possible by funding from the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. I'm Neil Half, and I'm director of the UCLA Center for Healthier Children, Families, and Communities. And today, we're very excited to kick off new webinar series on measuring health development of children and youth. This is a series of webinars that will explore strategies for developing measurement systems to monitor and improve children's health development trajectories. We will focus in this webinar series on the early development instrument and the middle development instrument as tools to gather information, inform policies, program, and inform research. These two instruments have had important impacts on the work that is being done in Australia and Canada and in many other parts of the world now. I'm particularly happy that we're doing this because it's almost 18 years ago that I was first introduced to the EDI by one of our speakers who I'll introduce in a second, Magdalena Janus. And from the very first instant that I saw what the EDI was about, what it could do, and how it was used, and what was going on with it, I realized that it was an invaluable measure of children's health development and well-being, could be used in a variety of ways, and we'll start to hear about some of that today. Also recognize that it was an important part of what would become a life course measurement system. And when the middle development instrument came along, second in a series of instruments, well on our way towards actually building new population health data systems where longitudinal trajectories of population could actually be measured. We're also very happy to be hosting this for a variety of other reasons, one being that we've been working with Magdalena and her team at McMaster's and Martin and the team at the Human Early Learning Partnership in British Columbia for the last almost 18 years now, as we've begun to use both instruments here in the US. And we're hoping that as through this webinar series, it'll allow others to understand both the importance and value of not just the instruments, but the whole approach that they allow as we move towards measuring health of populations, health development of populations. So today's webinar is an introduction to a comprehensive life course monitoring system. It's featuring Dr. Martin Guhn, who's an assistant professor at the Human Early Learning Partnership in the School of Population Public Health at the University of British Columbia, and Dr. Magdalena Janus, who's professor at the Authored Center for Child Studies at McMaster's University, both in Canada. Dr. Guhn draws from the EDI and MDI research to conduct research on social, cultural, and demographic, social, economic determinants of children and adolescents' developmental health, well-being, and educational trajectories. He's also very interested in school and community-based knowledge to action research. Dr. Janus and her team have helped implement the EDI in Canada for over 1 million children and have facilitated its adaptation internationally. Dr. Janus is interested in researching the transitions to school for children with special needs and indicators of early child development. Just a few quick technical comments. We've been doing these webinars for several years, but this is the first time we're doing it with a Zoom system. So we've been working out a few bugs this morning. So hopefully all will move forward smoothly. And also just to let you know, we're recording the webinars as well. During the presentation, all participants will be muted, but as a precaution, please be sure your phone or microphone is in the mute mode. Following the presentations, we will have a follow-up activity and discussion for which you may raise your hand. Use the raise the hand function to participate. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the chat function also as we move forward. And this webinar is scheduled to be about an hour and a half. We're starting a few minutes late, but we scheduled that way so that we could make sure that we could have plenty of time for question and answer. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our presenters.
So, can everybody hear me? Can I start?
Yes, Magdalena, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So, everybody can see my first slide.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil, and your colleagues for inviting Martin and me to do this. It's a great pleasure. I also wanted to thank you, Neil, for reminding me of a very stimulating and very fruitful meeting in January 2002. It's almost scary to think how long ago that was. But at the same time, I think you'll see from both what I have to say and Martin, and together as a group we have that there has been certain progress in terms of understanding child development, maybe not necessarily in improving children's outcomes, but we'll still just have to work a little bit more on that. In terms of sharing the presentation, I think both of us have mostly showing data that have been published, but I think if you wanted to use particular graphs or particular quotes from us, we both provide you with contact information. So feel free to contact us after the meeting. Let me start. And I think I really appreciate the opportunity to give the introductory part to this series. That sounds really interesting, because it's also an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the roots of this now population level understanding and opportunities of child development through data collected with early development instruments. And it really started in the latter part of last century, when the concept of children's school readiness to learn and the National Goals Panel, National Action Panel goals in the United States wanted to make sure that children all reach school ready to learn, but it really didn't have much attached to it in a sense of action. And the understanding of how much more than genetics influences people's behavior and people's success in life, especially with evidence for adults, was also growing. And then in the latter part, as I said, of last century, through pioneers such as Dan Offord, who was a child psychiatrist and epidemiologist, Clyde Hertzman, Fraser Mustard, Tom Boyce, the focus started being given to child development. And through representative studies, through sample studies, it has many of them from the United States, but some in Canada. Researchers noticed that the gradients in outcomes were also evident in children's outcomes, children's educational outcomes. Those that were coming from more disadvantaged neighborhoods that had parents with less education advantage were on average faring much worse in later educational careers, for example. The concept of social determinants of health was kind of coming to the fore. And this was to give emphasis that there are factors beyond biology that influence health of population. And the work of Clyde Hertzman and Dan Keating and Tom Boyce has shown that the way this environmental influence, the context in which child develops, gets so-called under the skin is through the biological, what they call the biological embedding. And that's because when there are certain circumstances that happen in early childhood, they are being reinforced because they determine the trajectory to a certain extent, where child will go, where they will develop, what kind of resources they will have access to, what kind of opportunities they'll be able to see. And these are reinforced and then result in long-term association and long-term outcome. In order to have a certain, in order to understand where, this is not changing, but the the point here was that sometimes there could be people with the same or very similar circumstances, but because of what's happening in the context of their early experiences, that could influence later outcomes. And I would like to change my apologies. Um, what really I wanted to show with this slide, which comes from a neuroscientific study that in which a volume of children's brain and gray matter was followed from birth to age 3, was if you look at the this part of the 5 to 7 month range for child's age, you'll see there is absolutely no difference in relation to the socioeconomic status in which this family finds themselves, whereas there is a meaningful difference. There is a gradient in terms of socioeconomic status by the time the children reach 3 years of age. And so basically that neuroscience helps us to illustrate that there really is a major impact of this environment that gets under the skin. And when these people here that you can see and to whom I'm always like to give tribute to, Fraser Mustard, Dan Offord, and Clyde Hertzman, when they had this idea that we really should be able to monitor child development at a population level, they realized that we really don't have any instrument. The data that were coming from sample-based studies, and they, to a certain extent, they were very useful, but they were not showing the full picture because communities would say they're not relevant to us. Our children were not in your study. And the same actually could have happened at the political level. Politicians could say, there's no disadvantage because this study does not involve my community. So the concept that we wanted to measure was really much wider than what has been talked about as school readiness, because at that time, so late 20th century, the school readiness was supposed to be mostly academic, reading and writing. The developmental health concept is put forward by Dan Keating and Clyde Hertzman really encompasses a wide range of the developmental outcomes: physical, mental, behavioral adjustment, literacy, mathematics, achievement. And in that context, Dan Offord has and his colleague has formulated this kind of request, this understanding that we really need more than just a measurement of one type of outcomes and more than just a kind of sample-based studies. We really need something that would be useful for social reporting at the community level, that would be feasible and socially acceptable to people. And basically what we needed were data to monitor child development over time, in context, reliable at the population level, in order to achieve a bioecological understanding of child development from birth to later years. But at that time, so about 18, 20 years ago, we really were in a position to, we thought that we needed that kind of anchor age. And what was the age where the most information was available to children? When they started school. We knew that all children are born ready to learn. So unless they have major developmental delays, they really, their system is open to take in any stimulation that they receive. The connections are forming. But what happens over that period of the first 5 years before they enter school? They all enter kindergarten with optimal developmental health, or more than that, a little bit more than the school readiness. And as a result of this conceptual and kind of critical need, the instrument we now fondly call early development instrument was developed. Through the requirements, the framework of implementation, the EDI is a population level measure of child development. It measures 5 major developmental domains. It is completed by kindergarten teachers for each child in their classroom. That's making it population level. And it's very important here to understand the distinction between population-based, which is basically samples from a population, and population level, which means that we cover the whole
Excuse me, Magdalena. Would it be possible? We're just getting some feedback from folks. It's a little hard to hear you. Can you increase the volume or speak a little bit closer to the mic?
I have my mic on my head, so
okay.
There is not very much that I can do. I think it's probably the connection, but I'll try to make sure that I speak maybe slower.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the 5 domains of child development that the EDI covers: physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive development, and communication skills, and general knowledge. Next slide, please. The EDI, the main measures are the mean average scores on of the 5 domains. We do not recommend use of a total score, because the total score, if we pretty much average the all 5 domains, we may really have children who do well in one area of development, but not so much in another, and it would really hide their vulnerabilities. So the idea was to have a different way of scoring the information from the EDI, and that was the concept of vulnerability. So for each of the 5 domains, in Canada, based on a normative sample of just over 160,000 children, we've established cutoffs at the 10th percentile of the distribution. And for each of the domain, the score is, each child's score is compared with that boundary, 10th percentile boundary, and a child is deemed vulnerable or not on each of the domains. Then, if a child has vulnerability on at least one of the domains, they are called overall vulnerable, which often we shorten to vulnerability. In that way, and in that early age, it really is important to recognize that even one area of development may really be detrimental to children's later outcomes. And actually, in actual fact, our validity studies show that it matters far less which domain children are vulnerable, but it really matters that they are vulnerable on at least one for their future development. Next slide, please. With the data like the EDI, and we'll be referring to that a little bit later, both Martin and myself, there is quite a lot of opportunities. So because of the inclusive and consistent national coverage in Canada since 2004 of that population of children just before grade 1 entry, we really have opportunities to create linkages, both with concurrent data, place level data, health data, but also linkages across ages and across jurisdictions. Next slide. The EDI, as you can see here, kind of anchors at 5 years, because this is the first time when children enter broad system that could be accessible in terms of understanding child development. That is available at a population level. But Martin will populate the rest of that graph in terms of the children's age with the potential for measurement and linkage later on. On top, you see here that this is how the EDI's results were. That's where our vision was, Dan's and Clyde's and Fraser's, where they will be useful not just on their own as one indicator of child development, but really the interpretation will have to go through understanding of the neighborhood context and all the other contextual data that now we are linking with through education and medical records and anything else that we can possibly find. Next, please. So this is where Martin will kind of expand in terms of the availability of various measurements. So the EDI is actually a little bit of an anomaly, because this is the only one that the teacher completes about the child. The ones on the other ones on the younger age would be a parent completed instrument, and the MDI is the instrument that's completed by the child themselves. Next slide. So to continue from the slide that I showed you a minute ago, yes, all children are born ready to learn, but in Canada, 27% of kindergarten children are vulnerable at school entry. And it's already a high number, but when you think about the fact that this number varies between jurisdictions, and by that I mean our provinces, territories, between 17 to 42%, that really is something that is very troublesome. And this number can vary even more if you go down to smaller geographical levels. So why is it important? Well, it's very important because children who are vulnerable in kindergarten are at least twice more likely to experience academic and social difficulties in later grades. And there is already quite a lot of information, quite a lot of validity and predictive studies that show us. So those dark clouds that kind of gather for children, unfortunately, in those early years are not going to dissipate. They really reinforce this lack of opportunities, lack of resources for the state that children have been in given birth. Next. So in Canada, from 2004 to 2018, we have collected the EDI data for over 1 million children in 12 out of the 13 Canadian provinces and territories. And overall level of vulnerability is 27%. And we see very strong difference in boys and girls, and association with vulnerability levels with the expected demographic characteristics. A little bit of yes, please. What hampered us a little bit in terms of producing these results that we have had over the past 12 years, 14 years, was the fact that in Canada, the EDI data are collected provincially. So this is great because the provinces have their own programs in terms of how to use the data and what to do with them. And neighborhoods are being established provincially, and data are linked to provincial sources. So in Ontario, for example, there is a poverty index that the EDI data contribute to, which is something different that other provinces are doing. But what really we were hampered through these provincial implementations in terms of comparability. So a few years back, Martin and I, and that was work that was led by Clyde, but unfortunately passed away in the first year of the project. We've set on to harmonize the EDI data from various jurisdictions in order to be able to come up with definitions of neighborhoods that would be comparable across provinces, and also that we would be able to add sociodemographic data available for population, so from tax filers and from census. So in our database, we have just about 800,000 valid EDIs. And in our database, we have 29% of children who are overall vulnerable. But if you look underneath that, the variation, the difference between the neighborhood with the lowest vulnerability and the highest is huge. It's over 70%, 70.6. So really that one number, which quite often people say, give me one number about, well, the statistics of child development. Yeah, we can give you that, but way more information is in that difference. And similarly to the socioeconomic status index that we developed using 10 variables, 4 from census and 6 from the tax filer data, which we centered in the census data that we had available for 2006. And then when we reapplied this to the next round of data that we had, it varied from 49 to 153. So again, there's quite a bit of variation in terms of what our neighborhood, what happens to children. Next one, please. What followed on the heels of the CONNECT study was the Canadian Children's Health in Context study, which objectives are very similar to our first study, but it includes children with health concerns. So on the EDI, we have information whether a child has special needs as they enter school, whether they have a medical diagnosis, whether they have functional impairment. And we're following that database with similar methodologies as we applied with our trying to typically developing children. What you can see from this table is that first we've looked at to what extent the neighborhood SES index explains variation in children's vulnerabilities per domain. So for typically developing children, you can see the results in the middle column, and for children with special needs on the right-hand side. And sometimes people would say, well, you know, children with special needs and health disorders, like why would neighborhood have anything to do in their outcomes, because they will go where resources are. They wouldn't necessarily just rely on the resources in the neighborhood as typical developing children. But when you look at those two percentages, with the exception of communication skills and general knowledge, the percentages are very similar, which basically tells us that the neighborhood level disadvantage acts on children with and without special needs in a very similar way. And this is a really important finding that has to be taken more broadly into. Next, please. Martin will talk a little bit more about these other aspects that we are trying to complement the EDI data with. So complement would be at the same time that we collect the EDI data, we're trying to get some information about the environments that children are growing in and how that may impact their development. So this is an example of the data combining the EDI results in 3 domains: physical, language, and communication skills, and information from our kindergarten parent survey, where we were asking parents how often they were doing various community activities with children. And without going into too much details about what it was, the 5 lines represent 5 different levels of income. And I think if there is one take-home message from those 3, you can see that the top line on each of the graphs, which is purple, is pretty much flat. So for children who are in the highest income levels, whether their parents do a lot of community activities with them, it really doesn't make any difference to their development. But for the lowest income group, which is the blue line at the very bottom, it appears to make a difference. So this is really a very important result in terms of being able to recommend community activities that are accessible, which was something that Dan offered had very much in heart. The community resources not only have to be there, but they have to be accessible to children who need them. And these data are not quite published. Next, please. So majority of the, as you will see in a second, the majority of the information and interesting results that we're getting from using EDI data comes from linkages with other data. In Canada, the 3 provinces that have these very well set up linkages, Manitoba especially, British Columbia, and Ontario, and other provinces are kind of catching up. Next, please. At the forefront of the linkages of EDI with other data is, really, however, Australia, and those studies mostly come from Western Australia, South Australia, and New South Wales. And I know that you're going to have Sharon Goldfield give a webinar on Australian EDI soon, but I just wanted to highlight here that the EDI in Australia started in 2003. Dan Offord went and gave a series of lectures in Australia, and people in Western Australia got really interested and adapted the EDI and used the data, used their instrument in their pilot in 2003, which led to really more interest and to the community-based project that included communities, which then led, and the instrument was renamed Australian Early Development Index, and then finally led to national implementation of Australian Early Development Census. So if you ever are interested in Australian data, all these 3 acronyms will come up, but it's really the same instrument. Next, please. We at the Offord Center are very conscientious about collecting information about every single piece of research that's published using EDI data. And so if you want to check this out, you can go to our website, and under resources, you have the infography of the EDI where these papers are listed. For example, in last year, in 2018, 28 papers in our list, and it's really interesting that the majority of the papers, about 2/3 of them, published results on using data linkages, either with prior information, so diagnosis of children, children's exposure to neurotoxicity, to anesthesia, testing for TSH or maternal depression at birth, etc. However, there were also studies that looked at cross-sectional data, about a quarter of them. Some were protocol or resource studies, and we had a couple of papers only that looked at intervention results. In terms of country of origin, I think our collective goal here would be to make that US little slice of the pie maybe a little bit bigger, but majority of these come from Australia, and I'm happy to say that the study from the US is from Neil's team. Next, please. I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about this one paper that neither Martin nor I have been involved with. It's a study done in Australia, but it really shows to what extent the opportunities of the database, like the EDI, opens up opportunities to not only look at children's developmental outcomes and environmental influences, but other issues that are really relevant to health policy. So here is an Australian study where they looked at the screening of children for TSH, and the current boundary for that screen for children to receive treatment is 99.9 percentile. So children who screen above that receive treatment, and their odds ratios for the risk ratio for being vulnerable in kindergarten is the same as for children who have very low risk for congenital hyperthyroidism. However, children who screen between 95th and 99.9 percentile, 99.5. So they have high levels, but not high enough that right now are mandated for treatment, are actually at much higher odds to be at risk in kindergarten than children who actually have high levels and then are treated. So that really, the authors of the paper really praise these results in the public health kind of framework, and saying, well, first, should more children receive screening, but at the same time understanding that that could have potential for higher costs of next, please. So I think what I really wanted to finish my part here with is that these papers that show linkages, that how we can link the child developmental outcomes at the population level. So for all children, that majority, large population of children, very few are not in our database. It really gives us opportunities for answering new questions that we may not even have known that could be answered, and opportunities for monitoring health prior to school entry, concurrent, complementary data, academic achievement, social networks, school graduation, and health outcomes. And pretty much all of these will be addressed in Martin's presentation. Next, please. At this point, I wanted to thank you very much for attention. I wanted to apologize for the issues with my slides, but I think we managed to sort them out, and this is the website where you can find them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Magdalena. Can people hear me now? I think it just got unmuted.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Magdalena. Thank you very much, Whitney and Erica and Neil, for the invitation and introduction. So I'll say a few words about what we call this comprehensive population-based child development monitoring system, and how a large network of researchers and ministry folks and community folks are trying to build this monitoring system based on the success of the EDI. So if you look at the bottom, the pictures, we're trying to understand developmental trajectories all the way from conception into adolescence and early adulthood. And the EDI is, of course, a tool that we have already heard lots about from Magdalena. So the question is, how do we extend this monitoring to understand what happens in life earlier and later on? And before I go into some concrete aspects of the data collection and the linkages, I'll say a few words about a conceptual framework that has helped guide our work. Let's see, is this? The framework is in some sense an iteration of other bioecological frameworks that have been formulated before by psychologists such as Yuri Bronfenbrenner and others. It was done by Clyde Hertzman with Laurie Irwin and Arjun Siddiqui, and they called this holistic early child development assessment model the total environment assessment model of early child development. And the gist of this is that if we want to understand early child development trajectories and how they affect lifelong health and well-being, we really have to monitor multiple ecologies, multiple social contexts and factors of children's development over time. So the vision for us is to really understand how the individual child develops over time within the context of family processes, within things that are happening in the neighborhood, the residential area, regional factors, whether they be cultural, social, economic, or otherwise. National programs, federal supports, the situation economically, global environment in terms of climate change, globalization, global trends in terms of markets and so forth. And then, of course, we have to think in terms of human development from a relational community perspective. So what are our networks? They're not always nested geographically, but they cut across regions. But are very important for our development. We have to understand how early child development services and programs affect child development and how these things all interact within the civil society we set up across institutional and historical time. So all to say is, it's a very, very complex overall picture. And the question is, how do you translate that complex conceptual model of child development trajectories into something that is feasible from a measurement and monitoring perspective, and then doing meaningful research with it. So our vision for this monitoring network has been to really collect data that allows us to create a bioecological understanding of child development. And the foundation of this has been the EDI, really as the endpoint of the early years. Of course, we have to link early years outcomes and experiences to later life course. Magdalena already talked about the advantages of collecting at a population level as opposed to working with samples so that we can map and examine variability at small jurisdictional or local areas. And then one of the technical challenges and privacy challenges is to link all these data sets, let alone collecting them. How do we link them at an individual level so that we can follow children over time? And we are doing this by using personal education numbers and other unique identifiers such as health numbers and so forth, which allow us to connect health data, education records, and our own data at the individual child level over time. So the EDI has been fascinating as a tool in its own right. You've seen a few examples presented by Magdalena. One thing I'll do for the BC context, and I'll say that I will be BC-centric in my examples because I'm most familiar with the research studies that have taken place here. But one thing that we've been able to do is look at trends over time. And Manitoba, Ontario, a couple other provinces have done similar things. This is 15 years in the making. So I came here as a grad student in 2003, hearing Neil Halfon reflect on the history of this. It's been a long time in the making. And so when we saw these trend lines, we were all quite excited because now we can see what's happening over time with these kindergarten child cohorts. And at the bottom, you see a time axis going from wave 2, which was the BC data collection in 2002 to 2004, all the way to wave 5 in 2012 to 2014. So it spans a time window of about 10 years. And what we're seeing that for the language and cognitive development domain, which is really about early literacy and numeracy, we see that EDI vulnerability is decreasing. So it started at around 12% and now it's at around 9%. So you could say this is a good news story. At the same time, same children, we saw that the trends for the social competence and emotional maturity domain were increasing in terms of vulnerability. So things gotten worse. These are the scales that measure anxious behavior, aggressive behavior, pro-social behavior, getting along with your peers and so forth. So if you put these two trends together, we see that they're going in different directions. It certainly has spurred lots of hypotheses and questions in terms of what's going on societally. Here in BC, we've seen similar trends with regard to numeracy and literacy in some of the other provinces, and maybe less pronounced with some of the social emotional domains. So it raises big questions about what's culturally or socially or at the provincial or federal level changing in our society with regard to child development. So one of the important linkages through the first kind of life period or life phase of the EDI has been linking it to neighborhood context data through obtaining census data and tax filer data from Statistics Canada. You saw a couple examples from Magdalena, and I'll just highlight one additional piece that we've started looking at with our Pan-Canadian group, where we not only kind of try to explain the variability. Here's an example of Vancouver, the city here on the West Coast, where you see color-coded the variability and vulnerability rates at the neighborhood level. So very dark red means high vulnerability here in the Strathcona area, and the very light means low vulnerability. And as Magdalena pointed out, there's a high correlation with socioeconomic status. When we plot this for the whole country, each bubble is representing a neighborhood in Canada, and the larger bubbles mean more children living in those neighborhoods. What's been really fascinating is, yes, we do see a gradient overall. So lower median income, which is plotted at the bottom, overall correlates with higher vulnerability rates, plotted here at the y-axis. But what was interesting in the top right quadrant, there's no neighborhood. So there's really no neighborhood that has very high median income and high vulnerability rates. Whereas if you go to the low SES range, the low income range, we saw a lot of variability. And what we're currently exploring using the social capital data that Magdalena has collected in Ontario with the kindergarten parent survey, and that we have collected through a survey here in BC, to see to what extent social capital or other factors may help us understand why we see that such great variability in terms of vulnerability rates at the low income range. Another linkage that has finally come to fruition, and it's been over 10 years in the making. Clyde, in fact, started this in the mid-2000s with the first request, has been linking the EDI data to medical records. And one interesting example is based on some work that was led by Kim Thompson, who was a doctoral student here at HELP. And she first categorized children into these profiles. So here's the title from the publication if you want to go into more depth. But the children were categorized into these social emotional health profiles according to the EDI data. And what we found is that the large majority, about 58%, were in a group that is really characterized by doing well on all these social emotional subscales on the EDI. But then for a range of the other groups, you see that there's quite a bit of crossover. For some, anxiety was the main concern, or aggressive, hyperactive behavior for these two groups, whereas for others, the patterns were slightly reversed. So that was interesting in its own right, just to describe the child population from a profile perspective. But then even more interesting was that when you use these profiles to predict mental health outcomes by linking it to health records, we saw that there's highly increased odds for these vulnerable groups. So the groups that you see here at the bottom had much higher odds for developing later on mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, conduct disorder, and so forth. And that study was published here in 2019. So again, I'm water skiing over these, but if you have more questions, please let me know, or of course you can look for more in the publication itself. So apart from linking to the medical records of the children themselves, another PhD student who worked here at HELP, Nera Razas, she linked EDI data to the medical records of the parents for which we had EDI data. And in this particular case, she looked at multiple sclerosis. That was her area of interest. And without going into too much detail about the findings, the interesting piece is that we now can look at parental health outcomes, in this case, multiple sclerosis, and the child development outcomes from a fairly holistic perspective using the EDI data, and see to what extent they are different from the general population. So here what you're seeing is that for each child that had a parent with MS, they were matched to children with similar demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. And you see that in this particular case, actually the vulnerability rates were mostly lower, not always significantly lower, for the children of parents with MS. So again, without going into the specific interpretation of this, the exciting part here is that we can now look at intergenerational associations between parental health and child development outcomes. What you see here in this slide is that we added education records to that linkage. So now we can look at grades, academic achievement, standardized achievement scores in the school setting. Can link those to medical records, health outcomes, and to the EDI scores, and of course the census data, which are linked at the aggregate neighborhood level. And I'll just showcase a couple of findings from that type of research, where we were able to link academic data for refugee children. So it didn't just mean to go to the Ministry of Education and get educational data, but we also got from the immigration office at the federal level information on which children came here as refugees and which ones didn't. This work was led by Monique Garnier, and what she found is that you can categorize children according to their trajectories. And what you see here at the top is a trajectory that's fairly kind of even. They're average, above average, they're doing fine. And they keep doing fine if you follow them from kindergarten all the way to grade 7. Then there are other children that start off doing okay, about average, but then they fall behind. So we call them the declining group. And then there's a group that doesn't look so strong when you look at their EDI scores early on, but over time they catch up. They start low, but they're improving. And what Monique was able to show is that the children, among the refugees, those who were emotionally unstable, they looked fine in the beginning on average, but over time they fell behind. So there was the emotional foundation wasn't there, and other things got in the way of learning. Whereas the children who may have struggled kind of in terms of their numeracy literacy early on, but they were stable in terms of their emotional and social development, they over time, they caught up on the language and other things, and they improved. So all to say is we can do really interesting things in terms of looking at trajectories and what predicts those trajectories for subpopulations among our children. Just checking with time, I think we're still good. So now the tool that Neil Halfon mentioned in the introduction, the MDI Middle Years Development Instrument you see here in orange at the bottom. So apart from doing all these exciting linkages, what we didn't really have at a systematic level was the social environment of children. And so what we developed with the lead of Kim Schoenert-Reichel, who is the current director here at HELP, was the Middle Years Development Instrument. There are 3 papers that specifically describe the tool and its development validation. So for your interest, I put the references here, but I'll focus on describing the tool itself. It's a self-report. So it's children sitting down in the school setting, in our case in grade 4 and grade 7, but you can do it at any kind of age within age to the 10 to 15 age range. And they're filling out questions on a range of domains that we think are of interest for that age period. So 5 scales fall under what we call the well-being index. We look at their life satisfaction, their subjective health, their optimism, their self-esteem, and their depressive symptoms or their sadness. We take all that information and categorize it into thriving, medium, and low well-being. Then on the context side, we ask children about their adult relationships at home and school. We ask them about their after-school activity involvement, their nutrition and sleep habits, and their peer relationships. And now that we have all those puzzle pieces, we can we can map them the same way we map EDI outcomes. So here's an example of the Lower Mainland in BC. For the city of Coquitlam, you see that we see similar variability in terms of children thriving according to their self-report when you go from neighborhood to neighborhood. And we did find that this also correlates with socioeconomic factors, not too surprisingly. What we also do is we map these social assets, adult relationships, peer relationships, after school activities, and nutrition and sleep. And when you put them all together, you find a very, very strong linear relationship between the number of assets that are present at a child or community level and the overall thriving index. So it really filled a gap in terms of understanding the social environment of children during the middle years period. what we've been able to do is link the data on the EDI to our MDI data and academic achievement data. So again, I'm putting the citation here in case anybody wants to look into it with further detail. But here's the gist in terms of the findings. So we linked EDI data to some scales from the MDI, student self-report, and then we linked the EDI data to some academic outcomes data. The FSA stands for Foundational Skills Assessment, which is a standardized test here in grade 4 in British Columbia. And what we find, and this is primarily kind of a validation study, that the EDI social competence and EDI emotional maturity scales were really the two scales that most strongly connected or predicted the student's self-rated connectedness with peers and their emotional well-being in grade 4. And at the same time, the language and cognitive development, so early literacy, numeracy, and kindergarten age, predicted most strongly the reading and math scores in grade 4. And social competence was still a significant contribution with regard to a couple of the scores. So all to say is we do see a signal, and it speaks to the validity of the EDI in terms of teacher ratings still being connected to student tests and self-ratings 4 or 5 years later. Just doing a quick check here. I realize I'm zooming through some of this, and it's been about an hour for everybody to listen. Any questions or any comments at this point?
Martin, I think this is going very well. I think we could open it up for questions now, or if you have, how many more slides do you have?
I'll basically point out 2-3 more linkages and say a couple of minutes about what we're currently doing with early years collection, and then I'll open it up. So if you give me 3 minutes, I'll be done. Does that sound good?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay, great. So for your reference, there was a special issue in 2016. It's a bit of a coming of age for the EDI because it's a collection of over a dozen of papers that look at a whole range of different research areas, but they all are based on linkages and comprise studies from Australia, Hong Kong, and Canada. There's been a recent successful grant application to link our data with geospatial environmental data, so specifically air pollution and noise pollution. So it will be really interesting to see to what extent that will create more insights about how social and environmental factors play together. There's a protocol paper published in case you're interested, and the basic idea is to link what you see here on the left is EDI vulnerability rates at the neighborhood level or at the individual level to geospatial environmental data, whether it's land use, pollution, air pollution, or noise pollution. So I'm a co-PI, but this is led by people who are really in the environmental health area. One gap that's still remaining and we're currently working on has to do with early childhood experiences and social context. So even though we now know how children are doing when they enter the kindergarten or school system, we don't really know too much systematically about what's happening to them beforehand. And so we have been developing a suite of new surveys. Magdalena mentioned them briefly. The one is the toddler development instrument. The other one is the kindergarten parent survey and the childhood experiences questionnaire. They're all parent completed. I refer to them as siblings because they're very similar. The difference is that the TDI happens when the children are toddler aged, and the KPS and check are happening when the children enter kindergarten. And the main purpose of these tools is to understand childhood experiences from kind of conception or from birth to school entry, looking at nutrition, outdoor play, physical activity, sleep, social relationships, and then a whole range of social context factors, including the caregiver well-being, the social support that caregivers and their families receive, and some of the resources that are available to families with young children in the community and in the neighborhood, including some questions on the following constructs, and then I'll wrap it up. So the TDI, check KPS, they even though they're brief, they kind of go across all the different ecological levels to ask questions about children's play, their screen time, caregiver-child interactions, for example, singing, reading, health behaviors such as sleep, nutrition, access to the healthcare system, visitations to dentists, immunization clinics, so forth, social support for family, whether it's from friends or family members, the caregiver well-being itself. Example is life satisfaction question, community resources and socioeconomic demographic context. And Neil, in fact, I often think of the paper where you talk about psychosocial family screening. This is all these questions are based on very careful literature review and doing our own longitudinal analyses to identify those questions that are predictive of later health outcomes and that we think are at least partially amenable to change through action at the community or higher up level. And with that, I'll turn over to discussion for questions, comments, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, both Magdalena and Martin. Are there questions that people have? And you can either type them in or you can be unmuted by raising your hand, I guess. Quite sure how you do that.
Just looking to be seeing those questions.
Again, please feel free to use the chat function, or you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself at this time.
Well, I see one from Lisa Stanley. What has been found in terms of the predictability of the EDI and MDI as it relates to children with special healthcare needs? Magdalena, do you want to start? I'll just pull one thing up at Magdalena, which I think I have at my fingertips, because we had a study conducted here in BC. But Magdalena, if you have anything else in the meantime, because I don't recall the findings, but at least I can forward the citation.
Magdalena, you might be muted.
Can you unmute? Okay, now.
No,
It was telling me that I couldn't unmute myself. So specifically, thank you, Lisa, for the question. So specifically, EDI to MDI, no, I do not believe that any analysis like that have been done. Some analysis, we have some data showing strong associations with children's outcomes, academic outcomes later on, especially in grade 3. What we were able to follow up was, so we have, for example, looked at children who kind of had unspecified special needs in kindergarten and looked at their status in grade 3. And actually not even, so what we found was that children who were later diagnosed with autism were significantly poorer in terms of their social and emotional subdomains on the EDI, but better in terms of on their language and communication subdomains in comparison to children who already had special needs in kindergarten, but were diagnosed with different developmental delays. So that's one of the examples that we've done. But I think that linkage between EDI and MDI in this context is really very interesting. I think what may be a little bit of a barrier, and I will have to explore that with Martin and Kim and Anne, is to what extent some children with special needs can actually complete the MDI, because it is a self-completed questionnaire. So it depends on the type of their special need. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just seeing if I can do this here. Can people see?
Yes.
Okay, so I just pulled this up, and I can't really speak to the content too much, but I hope that you can, look up the reference. So this is a study that was performed by Jennifer Lloyd with Laurie and Clyde back in the day, and they did look at children with special needs as a subpopulation and looked at the relationship for school readiness and their fourth grade literacy and numeracy. One thing, and I'm happy to share this later on, we started exploring a little bit in terms of special needs for different special needs groups with the EDI, and then also later on, I wish there was something more conclusive, but what was really interesting that the different special need categories, they really, and that's not my area of expertise, but they really seem to reflect the different social realities. So for example, for people who were impaired in terms of their vision or their hearing, the social relationships and connections to peers and adults in the schools, they look quite different and had different implications than for children who had maybe something that was more behavioral. And if you're interested, I'm happy to, if nothing else, share a couple of the initial analyses that we have done. But this was very exploratory because we didn't have all the full-fledged linkages in place to really do something more systematic.
That's great, Martin. There's another question that came in from Jim Russell, who said, "Great presentation, thank you. I'm from New Zealand, where we have National Child Health Surveillance Program from age 0 to 4.5 years. Are any of these development instruments connected to early child health surveillance programs?"
Sorry, can you clarify, Jen, what the surveillance, would this be screening, monitoring for certain things, and then whether those have been linked?
And maybe Jen can ask the question if I didn't get it right.
Jen, I've also just unmuted you as well.
You have to unmute yourself, Jen. There's a little button at the bottom of your screen.
Jen, I just unmuted you.
But you have to unmute yourself, Jen, also. If you look at the left bottom part of your screen. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, unless Magdalena, unless you know.
There you go. Can you, Jen? Should be unmuted now.
If it doesn't work, we can go to a couple of the other questions that I saw earlier.
Right. Why don't we do that?
And then maybe, Jen, if you can just clarify what the surveillance specifically does. And I mean, happy to have others kind of coordinate here, but I think the question after Lisa's was, have you seen interest in these outcomes from a policy funding perspective by governments? Yeah, that's interesting. We've had a similar question actually this morning in a similar webinar. So one example I mentioned is we went to Prince George to City Hall, talked to the group there about the trends I showed you earlier with the social emotional outcomes getting worse over time. and it prompted them locally to create a bit of a task force and a plan to come up with better youth and child health development outcome initiatives. The EDI data collection in BC is funded by 3 ministries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Children and Family Development. And of course in other provinces also, usually with ministry involvement. And they do use it to inform their kind of discussions. So it's primarily a kind of tool to inform government discussions, and I think to some extent also resource allocation. We do see that for their targets, let's say in their school plans, they say that they're aiming for different EDI vulnerability rates, and then some of their initiatives are tied to supporting families accordingly. So yes, it's used. It's hard to say to what extent we see a clear connection between initiatives and outcomes. And then maybe one final thing, the funding piece is really important, not just for, let me see, governments, but I think local organizations, service organizations, they often use EDI outcomes to ask for funding because it's such a rare scenario that you have representative data on early child outcomes, and they really do specify or localize need. And people say that it helps their applications for funding.
So if I can just add, I think, it does really depend on the government, and I really cannot stress that more strongly. There are some that definitely have social values kind of up front, and we see changes in terms of attention paid to the results. So on the kind of high level, this is very, if I can say so, vulnerable area. But at the local level, the way Martin described, we have communities, local health regions, schools, organizations that regularly kind of look forward to seeing the EDI results, because they usually come every 3 years or every 2 years, depending on the province. And the paths are very different in each province. So it happens in a different way in Ontario, different way in BC, different way in Manitoba. I think HELP in BC has much more kind of direct contact with communities. In Ontario, it's a much larger province, obviously nothing in comparison with California, but still. So this happens in more kind of indirect ways. In Manitoba, there's again a little bit more connection and direction, but there's definitely big uptake. There is still a lot of what we do and our colleagues and friends do in terms of making sure that communities understand that they have these data, that the data are available for them. But those that use them really look forward to the next wave.
Are there any other questions for Magdalena or for Martin?
There's 2 still on the board. I can try to address very quickly.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, because I'm not seeing them. Go ahead.
So one is about children placed in foster care, and I'm not sure whether you are in BC, Martin, because I'm not sure whether I made that clear before. In Canada, most of these databases are done provincially, so there's no way that we could kind of put all the EDI data, unlike we can do it at the neighborhood level, but we can't do it at the individual level nationally. So all these things happen provincially, so it's not always possible. But there is a couple of papers. There is a study from New South Wales in Australia that looks at foster children in foster care, and there are a couple of studies also from Australia that look at children who have been at risk or have been signaled as experiencing or potentially flagged for maltreatment. And the results are really quite mind-boggling, because there is really no gradient in terms of the potential exposure to maltreatment, whether it was actually proven and somebody was charged, or whether it was just a suspicion. If a child even experiences a suspicion of maltreatment, their vulnerabilities, they're at much more risk for vulnerability than those who a control sample. And to Efren, hello Efren, question. there are groups like that, and it generally shows that these are the children who basically have everything else going for them. So, you know, good socioeconomic situation, because you do have children who are vulnerable that still come from high SES families, not as many of them as from at the other end of the scale, and so quite often these would be the ones that were actually quite able to kind of make that leap to non-vulnerable or kind of doing well status from EDI to later grades. Martin, over to you.
Are there any other questions?
I think Martin wants to say something, but he seems to be muted.
Sure. Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, I just put it into the text thread. There's a student here that looked at the association between well-being and social support with the MDI, and you know, I'm just trying to double check that I'm not kind of misunderstood, but you ask about foster care. So these measures, so yes, the MDI, we do have children that indicate, or we have records that they were in foster care or are in foster care. And what we do see is that adult support at home and in the school is a very strong protective factor in regard to their self-rated life satisfaction and well-being. As you would expect, I mean, we see the same pattern for others, but it may be even doubly important for kind of this vulnerable group.
Great. Well, there's Jen Russell again. You can see the question on the question and answer board.
Okay.
I'll just read it out. The New Zealand Child Health Surveillance Program is a series of child health checks where all New Zealand children are assessed by a nurse interviewer at various stages. The Ministry of Health collects the data. Some measures include screening for things like autism, strengths and difficulty questionnaire, hearing and vision. There are anthropomorphic measures also. I'm wondering whether the toddler and EDI are standalone pieces of health infrastructure, whether they are incorporated in the existing health programs in early childhood. In New Zealand, I can see how we might incorporate the EDI into our child health surveillance program.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We have pursued for quite a while now a linkage between ages and stages questionnaire, which has been used here in BC. And I'm not going to say it's very similar to the strength and difficulties or the specific screening tools you're using, but same idea, broadly speaking, where at 9 months or 18 months, there's universal screening in some jurisdictions. We have the data, we have the EDI data for some of the children, but we are still in the process of getting the linkage. All to say is these things are taking place in some jurisdictions here in BC, and we're trying to create the linkages. And in fact, for the TDI, the tool that I described at the tail end of the presentation, we're working with a group that is implementing universal screening as well. So we're specifically trying to link those data to come up with more validity evidence and see what the benefit is of collecting them side by side. I wish I could give you more answers empirically, but not from our own findings or data.
So just to add, and you know, Jen, please feel free, if you think that there is space for EDI in New Zealand, we'd be more than happy to talk to you. I think the difficulty sometimes for us at least, and you know, in Ontario, the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education don't necessarily work together. So the EDI by the virtue of its nature, that it's teacher completed, belongs to the educational system. So again, you know, this is the advantages of the population level coverage is that you have to work with government surveillance or systems. So so that's why we know the EDI is not part of the health surveillance. It is part of educational kind of data collection, which is really nice. So then the same way as our later standardized tests are, but not the health part. So in Ontario, we don't have the ages and stages, we don't have the TDI, we have something else that's being done, but it's very, very much a screening and information tool with not very much usable data. And so this is really kind of something that we would like to incorporate and develop further, but it does not, in Ontario, does not exist. There is more of that kind of type of linkage in Manitoba, but again, not necessarily a developmental tool in those very early stages.
Here, I'm just going, I think that's a question by F Rain today. And I just want to make sure I go back to the one, I hope people can see this. The question was about whether some children start off poorly on the EDI and then do well over time. And I realized I went through some of these very quickly. For the refugee children, we certainly have seen the subgroup that falls exactly into that category. If you look here, the children that are doing poorly in terms of their literacy numeracy at kindergarten, some of them are catching up. And we think it's because they're socially, emotionally fine, but their communication skills are not there yet. So they're catching up. Whereas there's other groups that show different trajectories. We haven't done a replication for the overall population. So partially as a matter of capacity to do that kind of research, but we're certainly intending to, because that's of course really interesting to see how do we possibly in the long term change trajectories for the better for those kids who enter vulnerable but then turn out to be fine. I think we see the same with some of the other immigrant groups, not just the refugees, especially if language is a barrier. If that's the only barrier, many of them seem to catch up and do quite well later on in the school system.
Great. Well, with that, I think we need to bring this to a close, and I want to thank both Martin and Magdalena for great presentations. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties, and we'll hopefully work some of those out between now and in the series. Again, there'll be another webinar that'll be coming up on February 12th. It'll be advertised on our website, and we'll be getting that out to everyone. We'll be sending out a list of the whole series as well. So please contact me or Whitney or Erica if you want more information about that. And again, thanks again to our presenters and for joining us today. And with that, we'll conclude the presentation. Thank you.